Right, hello and welcome. I'm Rebecca Harding and I'm the chairman of the Society of Women Writers and Journalists. I'm delighted to have Neema Shah here as my special guest today to talk about her new book, Kololo Hill, which will be out on February the 18th. Neema studied law at UCL before going on to have a career in marketing, which is quite a jump to then doing her first novel, which is about a family who are forced to leave Uganda in the early 70s. Although the book is fiction, Neema's own parents and grandparents left India to make their homes in East Africa and later in London, where Neema was born and now lives. Neema, hello, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thanks.
Well, I'm a marketer as well, so I work with lawyers, so we have a lot in common. So it's quite interesting to meet someone that does that as well. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I absolutely loved your book. Now, if I show it to everybody, this is it. I mean, I've got a little paperback copy, but the hard copy's out, as I say, on the February the 18th. And I couldn't put it down. It was really, really good. And what I really liked was that there's some really gritty themes in them, but they're not political. And I found that the discussion was very balanced and very fair, which you don't always get actually on some of those themes. So I thought that was great. So tell us about why you decided to write, and was this a story that you particularly wanted to tell? Was it the story that drove you to write?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's strange because I always, like most people, I loved writing at school, and I studied up until English literature A level, and then put it aside,
Yeah,
and didn't really think I had enough of a talent or a skill to take it further. And it just, I didn't know any writers until I started writing Kololo Hill, and I wasn't aware of any writers in my circle. So it just wasn't something that I thought I could do. And so yeah, after school, I pursued law, partly because I just didn't know what I wanted to do, but realised very quickly that law wasn't what I wanted to do. Into marketing, and it's so interesting because I've then spent about 20 years actually in marketing, um, and people say, you must be really good at copywriting too. I just hate copywriting, and I'm not very good at it. I think that's a specific skill in and of itself, and I perhaps selfishly like being able to write the topics that I want to write about, which is what's
yeah,
good about fiction.
yes. Copywriting is very dictated, isn't it? About what you can say.
But in a way, I feel that everything I've done in the past, sorry if this sounds a bit out there, but everything I've done in the past 20 years was partly leading up to being a writer because as part of my job, my day job, they give you £100 worth of me money, and you can use that. They call it me money. It's basically extracurricular courses that you want to do on any subject.
That's great, isn't it? Oh, that's a great thing to do.
And so I did a creative writing, a short course, thinking, oh, it might help me with my copywriting. I might actually get a bit better at this. But as it happened, I realized how much I loved it, and I'd forgotten how much I loved writing. So I kind of in the back of my mind had this idea of writing about my own family background, as you
Mm.
referenced. You know, with an East African Asian family, and it was really surprising to me that there weren't other novels that any that I had come across, certainly from a British Asian point
Yeah.
of view, that had been written about this experience, and it is a part of British history as much as anything.
Mm.
And so that was what compelled me. And obviously, as with most debut novels, or a lot of debut novels, I should say, there is a semi-autobiographical element. I mean, I've never lived in East Africa, but apart from as a toddler, actually, I was there for about a year with my mum. But I think it's just you do want to obviously draw on life experiences with a first book to an extent. I think, or most books actually, when you're writing, it is based on life experiences, whether it's conscious or subconscious, I suppose.
Yeah, and you bring those out. So I mean, it talks about people's feelings in that move and really moving away from a life that you know to something completely different environment. So how do your parents and grandparents feel about the UK and the moves that they made?
Yeah, so I mean, just to give you a little bit of background, so my grandparents left India and Gujarat in particular in the 1940s, and actually partly the story is inspired by a story that my grandma told me. So she was probably only 15 or 16 years old. I mean, very young with
Mm.
a baby,
Oh,
And she
wow.
travelled on a steamer during World War II, so she remembers the blackouts and so on. And my granddad was already in Kenya, is where they settled. So that was quite a strong visual experience for me, I suppose, and
Yeah.
trying to take in the experience of that, like what
Yeah,
that.
that's very brave. Quite scary.
Yes, and you know, obviously they had an arranged marriage. They didn't know each other that well, and so they went to Kenya. My dad's parents went to Tanzania, and that's where my parents were born in Kenya and Tanzania. And then I've got extended family in Uganda, and there are a lot of other Asians. And the reason that they went over was because of the colonial history. So the British well, it was still they were still colonies at that time, so there were links there. And then yeah, my parents grew up in East Africa, and that's what they consider their home more so than India. My mum hadn't even been to India until she was in her 40s for the first time, so that connection was
Yeah.
very much there. And then yeah, then it came over in the 70s again with British passports, to better their lives, and that was the reason that my grandparents went there. You know, there was some famine, there were economic problems in Gujarat. That's why they moved to East Africa, and for the same sort of reasons, but slightly different, obviously, just to better their lives for them and their kids. My parents came over here, and that's where my sister and I were born. And I think, you know, what is really interesting about East African Asians, most of them will have had a British education. So my parents grew up learning about Austen and Dickens and, you know, all the things that I learned at school, really. So there's that link to Britain. And then I think it was difficult, certainly in the 70s and 80s. I spoke to my mum about what it was like. And, you know, she was confronted by skinheads and things like that and saying things, but she's very tough, and she just sort of said, I just ignored it. That's how she's put it to me. I don't know. It must have been
Yeah.
more moving than that. It must be more difficult, sorry, I should say, than that. But yeah, I think that they just accepted that as part and parcel of being an immigrant in any country.
So did they find that the gap between what they'd learnt in school about Britain, because obviously they'd have had like this image of what it was going to be like, was there a big contrast to what they actually found? Or
Yeah, I didn't speak in loads of detail about that, but I did sort of explore that a little bit with one of my characters when they go over to England for the first time. And it's not a spoiler, but before the expulsion, and Vijay, my character, he kind of, in some ways, they're very close to England. So it's not just the education, but the things that are sold in the shops, because there were a lot of British people living in Uganda and East Africa actually before independence. So you know, things like bird's custards were sold in the shops, and you know, very British things. They learned how to make things like Victoria sponges in school. So in some ways, they were very connected to this culture. And British films were still fairly popular when they were growing up, and you know, I know there's a bit of
yeah,
a dearth of them after that, but yeah, so in those ways they were connected to it, but obviously in other ways, when you're actually confronted with the reality, whether it's the weather or just, I know certainly in the late 60s and 70s, obviously Enoch Powell did his famous River of Blood speech, and so they had an inkling of what was to come when they came over here. And that's not to say that everyone was hostile either. I know that they have friends who are British and who welcome them as well. So, and
yeah,
that was why, as you mentioned earlier, you know, it was important for me to show all the different experiences. Just as for the Ugandan Asians, there were very different experiences. Some thrived and were welcomed, and you know, there were unbelievable acts of kindness by the British people towards the Ugandan Asians, but others faced racism. So I wanted to make
real
sure that
mix.
I showed those different experiences.
Yeah, it's such a luck of the draw, isn't it? Who you end up mixing with and who you befriend, isn't
Exactly.
it?
Yeah.
Mm. So tell everybody a bit more about the situation in Uganda, because it's not really very well known, and it was quite an education for me reading about Idi Amin and
Yeah.
what was going on at the time. So this is the early 70s, isn't it? So,
Yes, that's right. So, I mean, they're expelled in 1972, but even before that, there were political challenges. I mean, Idi Amin came to power the year before through a political coup. He had it's a military-based government, and the Ugandan Asians had some of them had been there for generations since the 19th century actually, but most of them had come over like my grandparents in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And that, so therefore there were a lot of Ugandan Asians who were born in Uganda and didn't know any other country but Uganda. But unfortunately, some of the sort of cultural situation was challenging. When the British were still in Uganda, there was a tendency to treat Asians slightly better than the ethnic Ugandans. Indians were considered more reliable, rightly or wrongly, and from those days there was, and I'm not trying to say that the British were completely to blame for all of this. They certainly weren't. There are other things at play, colorism being another, but essentially, yes, there was there was a difference of treatment, and so the Ugandan Asians were able to thrive and create businesses and more economic wealth than a lot of ethnic Ugandans, and that obviously led to some resentment. And then there are sort of tribal conflicts. So Idi Amin came into power by getting rid of large swathes of other tribes, basically men and boys. So under that sort of backdrop, he then decided, as with a lot of these situations, to find a scapegoat in Ugandan Asians and say, let's get them out, let's take their businesses, let's take their homes. They don't belong here. They're not Ugandan. They haven't integrated, which is obviously another theme of immigration and also racism, I suppose, the idea of integrating or not integrating. So it was against that backdrop. They were given 90 days to leave, and people had to scatter across the world. Those who had British passports came here, obviously. Others went to India, and they went all over the place, really. But it was that idea of leaving in 90 days that really struck me.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's what I mean. It's a part of our British history, but and I knew little about it before I started researching it myself, actually.
So that's the backdrop for the story. So can you give us an outline of what the story's about for everybody?
Yes. So I wanted to make sure that this, as with most historical novels, you want to make sure that it's not just about telling the history, because that would be a very dry novel, and the politics as well. I mean, they are definitely weaved in, and the way I've tried to explore that is through the very personal story of a family, an Ugandan Asian family. And there's a matriarch, Jaya, and her husband, Motajan. And then they have two sons, Pran, who's married to Asha, and then Vijay, the younger brother. And they're in their 20s. They are Ugandan Asian through and through. They've never known any other country as their home. And then it also explores their so-called houseboy, which is just the generic term for servants in the house, December, who's an ethnic Ugandan. And it's really about how, well, the family have some secrets already, and then the expulsion is thrown at them, and it looks at how they deal with that and what happens, and also what happens to December, who is actually part of the persecuted tribe, the Acholi. And it looks at what happens beyond that, both in Uganda and then into the UK for, I won't spoil it, some or all of it.
Yeah, don't spoil the good. Good thing.
And how but some of them do make it to the UK, and they then have to adjust and learn a new life again.
Yeah, no, I was just the whole wondering what was going to happen to them, and the pressure, and that really got me hooked, actually. So what sort of, sorry, go on.
Yeah, and I wanted those, there was the secrets from the family from before, and then there are more secrets piled onto that, and it's this idea of they carry nothing but their secrets with them to the UK, really. And how that impacts the family. So you've got the external pressures of the expulsion, and then the internal pressures of these things that they're not telling each other. So that's what I wanted to look at. Sorry.
No, it really is great. So what sort of research did you do? Because I mean there's quite a lot of information and a lot of different themes and aspects you had to get in there. So
Yeah.
how did you go about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I have had many family holidays in Kenya in particular, but also Tanzania, growing up. And although obviously they're different
Mm.
countries, there are similarities in terms of language and culture. So even though I didn't know I was researching when I was growing up, some of those things, I was very familiar with. But then when I started actually writing the novel, it's interesting. Um, there's not that many people who are willing to talk about that time, the Ugandan Asians in particular, because it was such a painful time for them.
Mm.
And there's not many books on it, both non-fiction and fiction, as I mentioned earlier. So that was a challenge. So I used a lot of documentaries. I found an amazing archive of YouTube videos, which were first-hand interviews with people that had been through the expulsion, run by SOAS, part of the University of London. And that was a godsend. It was hours and hours of footage of different people being interviewed. And in a way, I did speak to family members to an extent, but in a way it was better to have all these different interviews, because that's how I got the different faceted information, and they have very different experiences
Views. Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
and views. And reading other non-fiction by ethnic Ugandans and trying to just get an understanding of the country that way. And I think when I was first writing, I didn't have an agent. I didn't know if I was even going to be able to finish this novel. So I was reluctant to sort of spend too much money on something that might turn out not to be, might not go anywhere.
Yeah.
So I used as many resources on the internet as I could. So, Google Maps is actually very good for Google Earth, I should say. So you can explore different streets in Kampala and so on and things like that. So I did as
It's a
much of
great tip actually to other
that.
writers.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. It's really helpful. I mean, obviously it's modern day Uganda, but you can still get a sense of what it's like.
Mm.
But then I thought, okay, right, I've done a couple of drafts. I do want to get this published, and I don't think I can do that without visiting Uganda. So in 2017, I set off for a week in Uganda, and I spent time in Kampala and a little bit of time by Lake Victoria, which are two of the key settings for the book.
Yeah.
And I, hired a guide. I spoke to her actually because she was an ethnic Ugandan, and spoke to her and just tried to get a sense of what the food's like. And it was very interesting setting foot in Uganda, because partly because of all my Kenyan and Tanzanian trips, but also the research I'd done, it was a bit like the novel came alive around me, because I'd done all the research beforehand, which I suppose is unusual. I imagine most people do research trips quite early on in their writing. So it was a bit strange, actually, just seeing that actually my research come to life. But there were certain details, some that made it to the very first page of the book, actually, that I wouldn't have been able to include had I not been to Uganda. So it was a really valuable trip, and I think, and hopefully I made it a richer book for that.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely get the feeling that you're in the place, and
Yeah.
it's nice. So, I mean, the family, when they come to England, they experience racism.
Yeah.
But what I was really interested to see was the discussion of racism in Africa as well, and how it was both ways between the Asians and the local, the locals. That's the wrong word, isn't it? But there was a lot of racism going on there as well.
Yeah.
So, and you had experiences when you were a child of people telling you to go back to your own country and awful, awful stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, how did that? I mean, that was obviously a really key issue for you in writing this book. So, what did you want to really get out of that discussion in the book?
Yeah, I think that whole thing, yeah, it was in the playground, so it was other children who'd obviously learnt it from their parents, and just people saying, go back to your own country. And it really made me think, it really actually, I remember worrying about it quite a lot, because I think, what if they did send me back to my own country? What country? I've never been to India, and I don't, that wasn't what I considered a second home. I don't know Kenya or Tanzania that well to go and live there. I don't speak the language for a start. I really worried about it. I remember worrying quite a lot about it. But and even then later on, I suppose there are some other influences in this book. I wrote this book during the Brexit situation, during Grenfell, Windrush, Trump's rise to power. All these things were sort of playing on my mind, and a lot of those things that happened in the 70s in Uganda are happening again, obviously, in the UK. And the same with, Enoch Powell's speech, that those themes were very pertinent at that point. So it was kind of, history repeats itself. And I was really keen to explore what that's like at a personal level. And then looking at Uganda, and this is the thing where you have different races and cultures living together. And don't get me wrong, there were a lot of Ugandans and Asians who were friends. I do portray that as well. And December in particular, the houseboy, is very close to this family, but equally there was resentment. And as I said, that's to an extent understandable. Some of the Ugandan Asians didn't treat their Ugandan workers very well, and that sort of plays out. But that's the case again, as I said, in the UK. In that the family experience different types of racism. Some is very subtle and maybe not even, you don't even realize it's racism. And then some of it is more overt, obviously. So I wanted to portray my experiences, but also those of other people, and to make people think about the idea of home and how valuable that idea is, and how secure it makes you feel.
Yes, and I think that's the shocking thing, is the way they're totally stripped of everything that's their identity and the safe their lives. And the people that came in must have experienced terrible trauma and then not had any counselling for it, because there must have been nothing. I mean, they were trying to get homes and jobs and anything they could get, and yet they're probably suffering badly inside. So
yeah. And also I think the fact that it's one thing to be forced out of your home, I suppose. It's another to have 90 days, like 3 months to
there's nothing,
leave everything up. And as you say, psychologically, how do you ever come to terms with that? You're probably, the stages of grief or whatever, or loss, you're probably still in the middle of those when you're having to leave everything behind. And then, as you say, then having to, in those psychological circumstances, start again. So yeah, I mean, I should say that whilst clearly there are some very serious themes in the book, I have tried to balance that with warmer moments, with attempted humor at least. And that's life, really. Even in the darkest circumstances, people will find some form of light, and I hope I've shown that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very easy read. It doesn't come across as a sort of heavy book at all. It's a really nice, and the focus is the people and their feelings. So, and then you have this backdrop of these themes going on. It's how that affects their emotions and them as individuals. Sorry, that's my children banging up there. I don't know quite what they're up to.
It's just a way of life now, isn't it?
Yeah. You never know quite what's going to happen during the day. So the novel also looks at the theme of disability, which I was really interested to see, because I wasn't expecting that to pop up in there, actually. Because one of my friends is disabled. He's one of my best friends, and he uses a wheelchair and always has. And it's been going out with him such an education for me, because you see people's reactions to him and how they treat him. It's really interesting. So I was really glad to see that in the book. So why did you decide to include that theme as well?
Yeah, to be honest, the character sort of just came to me. It's Vijay, the younger brother, and he just sort of came to me. But also, I have family members who had and have disabilities. My grandma, the one that actually went to Tanzania for the last years of her life, was also in a wheelchair because of arthritis. So, and what I was very conscious of is that I didn't want it to be what defines them as people, and in terms of the character, and that's what I found with my grandma. Like, you almost forget after. I mean, yes, obviously she had challenges and stuff, but I wanted to make sure that I portrayed them as just as multifaceted as anyone else. And there's another character who uses a stick, and so sort of a lesser disability, I suppose. But I guess, again, that they're part of everyday life. We are all different types, and you don't see it enough, I don't think, in fiction. And I wonder if some people are scared. I hope I've done justice to people with this kind of upper limb disability. I watched a lot of again, a lot of bloggers actually who talk about specifically, and really talk about, with an upper arm disability, the things that they can do as much as what they can't do. And I thought that was really interesting. And I think for those of us who are able-bodied, as it were, there is a tendency to think that they can't do everything, but actually in some ways that Vijay is stronger than some of the other characters. So it's just trying to show that balance. And as with everything in my story, I wanted to show that. That said, again, I suppose it's partly other people's impressions, and some of the discrimination he faces is down to other people not understanding him, and not, in the same way as racism, it's just this feeling of difference, and how to make people very aware that they are different, and what we call today othering, I suppose.
Yeah, it's the layers, isn't it? Because he's got the racism, and then he's got the disability prejudice as well. So, for him, it's very challenging. But you're right, it is about other people's reactions. And I see that so much with my friend Carl, because he's hilarious. He's one of the funniest guys I know. And we joke and laugh and take the mick out of each other. I mean, but other people, it takes a while for them to feel that comfortable, because they're quite worried about these days, they're quite worried about saying the wrong thing. I think more than anything.
Yeah, and that's understandable, I think. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps why it's so important for us to show all facets of life, rather than shy away.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is your first novel, and it's a great achievement for a first novel. So how did you go about writing this?
Yeah, so after I got the bug again from the creative writing course, and remembered how much I loved it, I started writing a few scenes as part of that course, and I did a couple of other online courses in the meantime. And I think at that stage it was still quite tentative, and I thought, oh, can I actually do this? It's one thing to write a couple of scenes, it's another thing to write a whole novel. And it did feel quite daunting, especially despite having relatively little research to go on compared to, say, if you're writing a book on World War II, there's a lot of research out there. But it still felt quite daunting, trying to layer on the history and the politics in a way that felt accessible. But I had a rough plan of the story, but I knew so little about writing a novel, if I'm honest. But I just was sort of feeling my way as I went a little bit. And the plan I wrote just had sort of like beginning, middle, and end. I didn't really know much about structure at that point, or plot. And I wrote a first draft, and it was very light touch. I underwrite as well, so it was only about 60,000 words, and the final one's about 100,000. So
I'm sure an editor prefers it that way. Go, add in.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a bit of a mishmash. And the other thing about writing, the technique that I found, and it was the first thing I learned on my first creative writing course, was free writing. So, just writing whatever comes to you and not looking back over the editing. And that was a godsend, because I don't think I would have written a first draft without it, because I would have constantly been thinking, oh God, this is awful. But when you're just writing, it's only later that you have a body of work, and it's actually not as bad, hopefully, as you think.
She thought.
Yeah, exactly. It was also a mess because with free writing, I was just writing whatever scene I felt like each day. So it was completely out of order. So it was, the first draft to edit was a nightmare. And I swore I wouldn't do it with book 2, which I'm writing now, but it's the only way I can write. So I've had to stitch together sometimes just lines of writing to other chapters and things like that. So and the other thing was obviously having a day job. I wrote a lot of the first draft on my commute onto my phone.
On your phone?
Yeah, I didn't want to draw attention to myself, because that on a tube especially.
Oh, everyone reads what you're doing. I'm terrible at that. I see.
I would do the same, but I just thought, I don't need anyone else looking at this terrible writing. So So I used to write 500 words a day in the morning and then edit. And then once I had the first draft, I edited at the weekend and so on. So I wouldn't recommend it as a method, but it's the only one I seem to be able to write, which is which is what I have
It
to.
works.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, actually, it's great to hear, because I think one of the struggles for first-time writers is finding the time because they're working as well. And to hear that you did it on your phone on the commute is
Really,
great, you know, and that it was only 500 words a day, but you know, it got you there.
yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah,
I did write a bit more at the weekends when I had the time. And I think in the later drafts, there were certain craft books that really helped me. So Into the Woods by John York, which is actually more about screenwriting, but is such a good book for
oh, I
structure.
had that yeah, someone recommended that to me recently, so I just downloaded it onto my Kindle. So
Yeah, I
yeah, I
love
should have
it
a read.
because I'm not very good at structure and plot, and that enabled me to go back and create a structure to a book that didn't have very much structure. And I understood much more about how even a scene has a structure in a sense, and a chapter has a structure to it. And those are things that, despite having read my whole life, I never thought about when I was reading. So, and the other book that I'd really recommend for that reason is Reading Like a Writer by Francine Prose, um, which, again, despite being a reader all my life, that book helped me to understand and take apart almost and analyze book stories in a different way. And it does it at a line level, a word level, does it at a chapter level, and it's really that really helped move my drafts forward.
Yeah, because I was interested in the voice that you use, because obviously you change. I mean, you change from a different perspective, don't you? So you tell it from one character's perspective and then another.
Yeah.
What made you do it that way?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think because there's not that well. First of all, there's not many books written about this time period, but also there's not many British Asian novels about these sorts of characters, and so and they all have very different experiences. So it's 3 points of view. So it's Jaya, the matriarch, who's in her 50s, and again, you don't often hear from that point of view, of an Asian woman in
no.
her 50s. And then Asha, who's in her 20s, but again, Asian women aren't written about that often either. And then finally Vijay, who obviously has the disability, but um, it has it has a different sort of perspective again as a man. And I wanted to sort of contrast that with Jaya and Asha. Um, and yes, it's told in third person because actually I find third person easier to write in than in first person. And so, and also it gave me a chance with third person to be able to add in as a narrator, the authorial narrator, I guess, the little bits of information that you might need, or the aside, and in fact, it's quite a close third person point of view, but it again allows a bit of balance in a way that a first person narrator wouldn't be able to do. So yeah, and that seemed to work. But again, that adds so many structural problems because you want to make sure you're getting enough of each voice in. And again, I wouldn't recommend it for a first novel because it was such a headache to do all of these things. But it came together in the end.
Yeah, it did. It did. So, I mean, it's interesting you say about the Asian women, because that was one of the things that struck me, was that they don't often feature in literature. And particularly, as you say, sort of 50-year-old Asian women, we don't hear their point of view at all, really, do we? So, was that a really important aspect, was to portray these women and show how
Yeah,
they
it
were?
was. And also, Jaya is the one point of view character who has had to leave two homes. So she obviously left Gujarat and went to Uganda, and then came to England subsequently. And so I don't think that's giving it away because it's a point of view character, but that for me was quite interesting to explore. But also, I think I wanted to subvert. I don't think everyone thinks this, but there are certain stereotypes about Asian women being quiet, meek, submissive, and that's not my experience around in my family at all. And in some ways, Jaya is very petite, and she's tiny. She's not very tall, but in other ways, as in a character sense, she's stronger than perhaps anyone. And I wanted to look at that, and I also wanted to do the same with Asha, who is younger and has a different point of view of what it is to be an Asian woman. And one of the things I also wanted to explore in terms of the characters is how moving to different countries changes your perspective, changes or even makes you realize certain aspects of your personality that you didn't know you had, or different aspirations that you might not have been able to have. You know, it's still quite a traditional culture in Ugandan Asia, but sorry, in Uganda, I should say. But coming to the UK, where it is obviously a more modern sort of culture, you can't help but to be impacted by that in different ways. And so I wanted to explore that as well, and the differences that brings to the characters.
Yeah. So which was your favourite character?
It's like asking you know, to choose your favourite child, isn't it? But I really like I like them all for different reasons, but Jaya and Asha for the reasons I've just sort of stated, I guess. But actually, it's a secondary character that I like most, and I like writing most. And I suppose with secondary characters, sometimes you can have a bit more fun that you won't be able to sustain for, you know, you either annoy the reader or you annoy yourself writing them. But Motajund, who's the father, he's really funny and a bit oblivious a lot of the time, but it creates some interesting scenarios. But in the later drafts, I've tried to add a bit of depth to him, and actually I really like writing him. So yeah, I think he's quite an interesting character. And again, I have to say, it's a lot of the secondary characters. Mrs. Goswami is another, who's a very overbearing friend of Jaya's. You know, I think that's where you can have a bit more fun as a writer than you probably can with the actual main point of view characters, because like I said, you just annoy people, I think.
So as a first time writer, how did you go about getting published? Because that's always the battle for everyone. And you said you didn't want to spend too much time and money on it, too much money on it in case it didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So I think after about, you know, when I got a decent chunk of it, especially at the beginning, how I wanted it, I started thinking about obviously finding an agent. I wasn't quite ready because I didn't have a full draft, but I started to enter some competitions, and miraculously, the first competition I entered, the literary consultancy Pitch Perfect competition, which involved reading a piece of work to agents and publishers, which was quite terrifying in an event. But luckily, I was able to win that, and that included a prize of a manuscript assessment. So when I had my manuscript, I was able to get an assessment. And you know, as a first-time writer, as someone who doesn't have any formal writing education, I think that was really helpful to me, and also getting beta readers to read it before I even thought about applying to agents. Luckily, a couple of those agents who were judges did say, would you like to, I'd love to see your work when it's finished. And I continued writing it, and then I started to investigate who might be able to represent me as an agent. And I tried to look for people that had obviously who represented other historical writers, maybe also represented other people of colour and things like that, just to try and get a feel for who might be appropriate. And yeah, and then, you know, started writing to agents. Rejections rolled in as ever, but luckily I got a few full manuscript requests, sent them out, and in the end I was lucky enough to have 2 offers of representation. So I met them. You know, pre-pandemic, you could actually go and meet people.
No, really.
And actually, they were really good offers. I was lucky. I really gelled with both agents, but decided to go with Jenny Saville, who's my agent now. And yeah, and then we started to work on it together before it was then sent out to publishers.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, and what advice would you give then to a first-time novelist, you know, who's facing all this? What would your top tips be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rejection is such a hard part of it, and I think I can't imagine there's any writer ever who hasn't faced some form of rejection, and it is unfortunately a part and parcel of being an author. And also, you know, the other forms that it takes once you are an author. So whether it's bad reviews or whatever it might be. So I think it's trying to accept that. It's easier said than done, I appreciate. And also the waiting. And this is one other thing, actually. When I, because, you know, most agents will say, we might not come back to you for 8 to 12 weeks. Some might say, if you don't hear from us, that's, you know, that's a no. And it was only once I got an agent myself, I realized just how much they're juggling. So they have all these submissions coming in. They're trying to keep their existing authors happy. They're trying to send submissions out to editors. And so, you know, when I sent my full manuscript off, I was like, oh, it's been, you know, a month or whatever, and they haven't come back. That's going to be a no. And now I realize, you know, even 2-3 months of a full manuscript being out is not that long. So it's hard, and I would suggest writing something else in the meantime, and just trying to keep your mind focused on the next thing. And again, that's easier said than done. And biscuits help a lot. Lots of biscuits. So I think those.
I'm trying to lose my lockdown weight at the moment.
Yeah, but I think also biscuits are another part of being a writer, to be honest. I've told myself that anyway. And the last thing I'd say is, you know, just research the literary agents that you're applying to. And I know that sounds basic, but what I mean by that is also then including references to those agents' work or representation in the letter itself to show that you really, you know, it's not just any agent that you want that particular agent, and then that's likely to get you much further.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting, and I wish you lots of luck with the book. So it's coming out on the 18th of February. So, and if people want to get hold of you or get a copy of the book, where can they go?
Yeah, and definitely I'd love to hear from people. I'm quite active on social media, particularly Twitter and Instagram. And my handles are actually on my website, which is neemashah.com, easy to remember. So, and I have some blog articles on there actually about writing and about how to find a literary agent and things like that, which might be helpful to some writers. So yeah, definitely get in touch. And then in terms of buying the book, again, there's links on my website, but the usual places, so Amazon, Waterstones, Foyles, and, you know, places like Hive as well, and independent bookshops.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thank you very much. And if and so you've heard where you can get the book, so do go and read it, because it really is fabulous and I loved it. Now I'm losing my microphone.
Oh no, it's given up.
Banging it, yeah. You can tell it's Monday morning, can't you, that we're doing this? But if we've got various other interviews coming up. We've got Simon Brett coming fairly soon as well, at the end of January. So do look out for that if you're interested. And thank you very much, Neema. That was fabulous.
So much for interviewing me. Thanks a lot.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Bye. Bye.